is some writing on kind of these different degrees of anger, and how there is anger as a result of being oppressed,
Mm.
and that there is this righteous sacred rage that can come through as a result of that, because the boundaries that are being violated, which anger is an indicator that a boundary has been violated, or that there is a risk of threat, or a threat, right, to the security of the species. And and so that's an appropriate response. But when you're living in an oppressed state for so long, right, eventually that anger is unproductive,
Mm.
right? Because it's kind of like, what am I going to do with that anger? It's not actually going to change anything. And if anything, it's going to either harm others or harm myself. And
Right.
generally speaking, we know that typically the feminine will swallow their anger,
Right.
will absorb it, right? We'll take it on. Generally speaking, typically the masculine will explode their anger, will externalize their anger, right?
Mhm.
And so when we're experiencing what it is that you're describing in response to personally witnessing an oppression, a violation of another species,
Mhm.
really, right? Like,
Mhm.
when we are realizing that, that these people are overtly disregarding another gender,
Mhm.
and misusing their power as a result of that. And in face of that, it doesn't matter how much you fight, it's that feeling of the thumb is still pushing down on you.
Mhm.
And, you know, of course, what I have experienced in the realm of oppressions is nothing in comparison
Mm.
to what other minority groups have experienced, in particular
Totally.
our Indigenous people of Canada, who
100%.
I believe have experienced and endured some of the most horrifying forms of oppression and violence. And and so the appropriate response to all of that is, this virtuous, righteous rage where, you recognize the injustice in it all,
Mm.
and we're tormented by it because it doesn't matter how many laws come in, it doesn't matter, what
Yes.
the public is saying, it doesn't matter how anti this and anti that we have going on, it's still happening,
Mhm.
and the impact is still real. And the impact of all of that is that, it keeps those in position of power, it keeps them in those positions of power, and it keeps those who are under the thumb of oppression and violence, in that state of collapse, powerless, helplessness. And that anger and rage has to go somewhere.
Mm.
And, this is why it typically ends up in traumas, right? It ends up in microaggressions. It ends up in um, Stockholm syndrome. It ends up in addictions. It ends up in more violence. It ends up in crime. It ends up in self harm. It ends up in suicide. It ends up in all the things that we see because we can't actually create the change that we're seeking in response to, something that we know is incongruent and disharmonious and causes harm. And that's the rage. It's the
Mm.
disempowered feeling that it doesn't matter how far we've come, there's still this sense of being oppressed and being a lesser than. And so it's like trying to stand up to the bully.
Mhm.
You're standing up to the bully as a kid and you've got all this bravery and you do it anyways, and the bully still knocks you down and laughs at you. right? And it's what,
Mhm.
not until a group of people maybe stand up to the bully and shun the bully or shame him or,
Mhm.
or fight back. And suddenly the bully is humiliated and maybe something shifts for them. But of course, we know that the bully is also a product or a byproduct of the system that we're in.